And welcome to this two-part webinar on how governments can use data to help tackle COVID-19. I'm Matt Ross, Editorial Director of the Publishing House Global Government Forum, which serves civil servants around the world. We've organised these webinars because it's clear that effective use of data is crucial to government's ability to control the spread of coronavirus, to help people recover from it, and to tackle the medical, social and economic damage it leaves in its wake. Looking around the world, we can see that those countries which use data to underpin extensive testing and contact tracing systems have tended to suffer far fewer deaths, with a clear, detailed picture of the virus's spread and the ability to trace, track and isolate those who may be infected. They'll also be able to relax lockdowns more easily and respond more quickly and accurately to local outbreaks. And data will be just as essential in identifying effective medical interventions and coordinating health organisations, in ensuring that essential equipment such as PPE is delivered where and when it's needed, in targeting financial support and understanding COVID's effects on economies, and in providing services to those affected by COVID-related problems such as long-term medical harm, mental health issues and disrupted educations. Both webinar sessions bring together data experts from national governments with external data specialists from international bodies and other institutions. And in both, we'll be talking about the opportunities, the challenges, and the routes to progress, with lots of examples of effective work. But each has a different emphasis. The second session will consider big data technologies, meaning the use of anonymized data sets to identify patterns, informing policy design and service delivery. This one focuses on the use of data on identified individuals and organisations to deliver services. So on the prevention side, for example, that covers matters like testing, contact tracing, quarantine management, and shielding of vulnerable people. And on the response side, it includes things like logistics management in COVID-related supply chains, financial support for those unable to work, and business support for damaged organisations. The dividing line between the two sessions is a blurry one. We're bound to stray across it, but that's the kind of emphasis in each case. So over the next 75 minutes, we'll consider some of the ways in which data can be used to respond to COVID and explore the skills, technologies and techniques required by governments to make use of that potential. We'll discuss the obstacles that can hamper government's progress and think about how governments can retain the public trust that's essential to realising that potential. Like the second session, this panel discussion will begin with short presentations from our panellists and then move on to questions. Very keen to get questions from the audience and we will save time for them. So if you have any questions for the panel in general or individuals on it, then please click on the Q&A button at the foot of your Zoom window. Type in your questions and I will keep an eye on them and we'll save plenty of time. We'll get through as many as we can. Before going any further, I want to thank our knowledge partner, MasterCard Data and Services. Their support enables us to provide this as a free service to public servants. And our panel. In this session, we have Johannes Jutting, who is Executive Head of the Partnership in Statistics for Development in the 21st Century, otherwise known as Paris 21. It's an initiative set up 20 odd years ago by the UN, European Commission, OECD, IMF and World Bank to promote the better use of statistics in lower income countries. Liz Luckendorf is a Senior Research Analyst at the UK's Central Digital Function, the Government Digital Service. Fabrizio Bolando is Executive Vice President for MasterCard Data and Services. Enrique Zapata, main lead for data intelligence and new technologies, working in the Digital Innovation in Government Directorate at the CAF Development Bank of Latin America, and Jenny Tennyson, Vice President and Chief Strategy Advisor at the Open Data Institute, a UK non-profit organisation that advocates the use of open data to create positive change around the world. So if we can drop through comments from each panelist, starting with Johannes.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. Thank you very much for this kind words of introduction. Good morning, good afternoon. I wanted to start with making 3 points basically on the question of how data can be helpful in providing a very good response to the COVID pandemic. So I think the first point is, and I speak here also as a representative of statistical offices all over the world, is that it's really amazing to see of how data has climbed up the international attention agenda. Just a couple of years ago, one couldn't have imagined that governments were taking decisions like a lockdown based on data and evidence. So I think it's really great to see of how data and evidence has made it up to the international agenda all over the world. On the other hand, we have also seen that at the same time, we see more and more conflicting messages, conflicting data sets, conflicting evidence, and the ordinary laymen and citizens sometimes get confused and ask themselves, what's going on? Can I trust this measure, or can I trust that data set, or can I trust this expert? And people start to debate about data and statistics and based evidence, which is also good, but we also need to bear in mind that there's always a risk of confusion, in particular in societies that are polarized. So in that sense, the support of national statistical offices as a trusted government agency is key in this very moment. Unfortunately though, and this has been shown by an analysis of Paris 21 and UN agencies, these agencies all over the world are squeezed because, as you can imagine, like us, they work from home, and so they can't do their regular interviews. They can't ask for the prices, knock on doors. They have to do this by phone. So it's a bit of a challenging time for statisticians all over the world and for data. But I really wanted to start with this very positive point that data and evidence is based back on the agenda. Now, Matthew mentioned a very important second point, which is key for the efficiency of COVID responses, and this is trust. And I think we have seen this. I live in France, I'm a German, so I follow both discussions in both societies and in both countries. And if you recall the discussion about the tracing app and how this has been discussed in societies. And of course, people are very eager to understand what happens to their data. If they download this app, what happens to their personal data? The security aspect, confidentiality aspects, privacy aspects is very important, and trust is a key issue here. So in that sense, the question of trust matters a lot for the efficiency of responses. The other thing is about, and we don't, at this stage, we don't need to go into detail, is about wearing masks, yes or no. I mean, and what the evidence tells us, and in which societies this is sort of signaling for political support and not. And the last but not least on this point is really the efficiency of public service provision. You have to detect the vulnerable people through good data. You have to know where they are if you want to reply targeted response. And again, here, data matters so much. Let me come to the last point. How can we get there? How can we get to efficient responses to inclusive recovery policies? Here, I think there are a couple of interesting examples also to tell from countries. But the main point I want to drive home here is a term that we want to coin like participatory data ecosystems. Participatory data ecosystems, what does that mean? It means that in a data ecosystem, there are different actors. We often think about national statistical offices. We often hear about the data coming from MasterCard or Facebook, private companies. We hear about citizen-generated data. We hear about the academics. I think we need to bring it all together until under some sort of data stewardship and guidance. And here the involvement of citizens is key. Citizens should be able to participate in data production, in data dissemination and data use, and which will enable them also to be using data from the governments in a more trusted way. Let me just conclude by giving maybe one or two country examples to make it more concrete. Philippines, we work very closely as Paris 21 with the Philippines since more than a decade or so. And Philippines is a really very interesting country where a lot of civil society organizations like the Social Weather Station produce data and statistics on hunger, on poverty levels that are published and which are also influencing and engaging in the public debate. the Canadian Statistical Office, they put out a tool for civil society organizations to assess their own data. So that they don't assess the data using their quality frameworks from citizens, but they have an own tool that they provide free of charge to interested citizens group to assess those data. And last but not least, an example from Kenya, where parents associations use scorecards to evaluate school performance. So these scorecards are used to assess the public service of education and give feedback to the educational ministry, line ministries, to assess the progress of education in school. So with this, I wanted to say this is an amazing topic. Thank you for bringing it to the attention. The key issue seems to me here, trust. Trust is very key. And I think it would be very interesting to hear in the debate of how we can strengthen the trust between governments and their citizens to produce data that make a difference for better data, better policies, better lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Janus. And yes, I think the trust will be a key issue for us to discuss in the debate afterwards. Let's bring it down from the international to the national level. So something from you, Liz.
Hi, thanks for having me. So I'm going to talk about two related things about the UK's COVID response. But before I start, I think it's important to mention that the existing digital foundations that the UK government has created, our skills, our policies, have really shaped the way we responded. And the 2 points I'm going to talk to are, one, a service that we developed, and two, the way we managed the digital response across government. So Gov.uk doesn't necessarily create a lot, or GDS doesn't create a lot of citizens-facing services other than perhaps Gov.uk, which is the biggest one. But during COVID, we launched two. And the biggest one was the one that was for clinically vulnerable people to register so they could get food delivered. So essentially, the NHS was able to identify through an algorithm, the NHS being our National Health Service, the people who would be most affected if they caught COVID and would be seriously ill. And those people were part of the shielding service, and they had to remain at home, not even allowed to go out even for the limited amount of kind of exercise per day. But then the problem there is, how do they get food? How do they get medicine, basic supplies? So this is what the service was meant to do. And there was also a back-end component that helped local authorities also get access to data to find out who was most vulnerable in their local authority area. It was a huge collaborative effort, probably one of the biggest I've seen since the launch of Gov.uk, which involved everyone. So it involved us as GDS and the Centre of Government, our Ministry for Housing and Local Government, our Environment Agency, DEFRA, Department for Work and Pensions, as well as private suppliers for supermarkets and food delivery, so wholesalers. All of them working together to make this service work, a huge logistical challenge. And it was essentially one big data pipeline. So it started with this algorithm that generated a list. Eventually, it was about 2.5 million people who were identified. That data was then used by GDS to segment to the relevant local authorities, and also to, like, we only got a small segment of that data, obviously no health data, and then also pass on the relevant bits to wholesalers to deliver food and things like that. But I think the important thing to factor is that it wasn't just the data, it was the capability from the NHS through to GDS that were able to extract the data, chop up the data, distribute the data in a kind of safe and secure private way with GDPR compliance and all that. And if we didn't have, like, our technical operations team, and if NHSX didn't have engineers either, like, would have this even been possible? So a really big lesson I think we've learned is that when things are outside of a normal BAU policy or delivery bubble, like you have your set kind of users and you're delivering for them, a crisis like COVID or anything else, maybe climate change in the future, creates entirely new user bases that have no kind of policy around them or anything. And you have to use existing systems and data to help them in that, through that crisis. And so when you're thinking of building your data system and your data teams and building whatever to help you deliver in the future, you can't just say this system X talks to system X and that's it, and there's no possible way otherwise. Because then you get into the situation where when this crisis happens, you need to be a whole lot more resilient and flexible with sharing data and being able to deliver services in that crisis. And in a slightly exploded view, I want to talk about our digital data and technology function across government. So we have spent a lot of time developing the digital function at the center of government. There's about 17,000 digital and data technology professionals across the UK government now. We had a working group, or we have a DDAT board, sorry, I'll use a short form now, that has all the senior digital people across government meeting regularly to discuss problems across government. And some of them prior to COVID were already known, things like everyone using, you know, communication tools that can talk to each other. We use Google Suite at GDS, and a lot of government departments can't use it. So then can we use Teams? Can we use Zoom? Like all of that was already a known problem, and COVID kind of kicked it into high gear to solve. But we used a working group from that kind of senior pool of digital professionals to be the single place where all of government could go for digital technology help. So they could say, we need to build this, we need these skills, we need these people. And because we had a common framework for technology skills across government that defined what these people did and the skills they needed, we could literally move people around to cover the most important services. So my team, for example, about half of us went to work on COVID, including myself. So we kind of dropped tools on what we were doing because we could, and we shifted over and supported the service. I helped support the vulnerable people service. This group met twice weekly to be quite like up tempo and be able to triage all the things that came through. So, you know, if they needed a tech arc, if they needed a data scientist, if they needed whatever, they could do it. At the same time, we were able to collect information from across government about what was going on. So we knew, for example, that there was about 147 public-facing activities going on, from services to just general kind of outreach. And that 52 of those were using the design system that's run by GDS, so that their services they built would be as accessible as possible, because all those components are tested. And so we were able to understand how all of these services were being developed and created, who owned them, where duplication occurred so we could remove it, and things like that. So the two biggest lessons I think we've learned is that having this strong function and this foundation really helped you respond quickly. We wouldn't have been able to make a service in a weekend like we did with the vulnerable people service if we didn't have all the capability around us and the structures and our cloud hosting providers and our components. But then also, it's not just about technology, it's the people using the technology, the people understanding the technology to be able to devise solutions that meet users' needs at the time of need. So we wouldn't have been able to work at pace if we hadn't had all these people and all these processes and structures in place prior to COVID. And hopefully that will also help us in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Liz. We'll move directly on from here to Fabrizio.
Thank you, Matt, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I see that we have people connecting from around the globe. And let me first introduce MasterCard. And you know, we're the odd one out here, not belonging in a strict way to the government, to the public sector. But let me describe why we're here. And you know, obviously we're a private company, but not in the strictest form, because you might know that MasterCard is a network. So we don't issue cards, we don't provide cards, we don't give credit. All we do is connecting the actors in the system of a country, of a government. And with that role, there are very few companies that are in the role. Actually, in our industry, there are only 2 global companies, as in Visa, that play that role. And because we play that role, which is key to the infrastructure of countries, we very often work alongside and cooperate with governments. And it's not only for the usual payment infrastructure that help the economy to function, but think of the support, that mobility system and transport system. Think about the war on cash, the war to black economies that in many markets are still very important. And we're also very active in financial inclusion. There's 30% of the population that does not have access to a bank account, and therefore does not have access to a number of services that will help us to grow. So our collaboration with governments has always been very, very strong. So in this case, when the COVID started, we felt our responsibility to reach out to our partners and help in every possible way. So how can we help? Let me share with you what we do, what I do all my time. I'm responsible for the data side of MasterCard. We see a few trillion transactions every year. It's quite a big numbers. And there are two things that make us, I believe, a very good partner for governments around the world. The first is that, as I said before, we're very much a global company. So we see what happens around the world. Many companies see what happens in their own borders. But we also see what happens between borders, which is not obvious. I mean, a lot of other industry cannot have that. The second one, which is probably even more important, is that we see things in real time. And by matching global footprint in real time, we are able to see what happens around the globe and what behaviors drive the economy. And this is obviously, I'm going to focus on the economic part, because as we all know, COVID is taking a toll in terms of health and lives, but also is disrupting economies. So let me focus on the economy, especially in this moment where countries are in what we call hopefully the recovery phase, where they want to open up the economies and they need data on what's happening every minute, every hour. Many countries have different policies. I'm an Italian national, work for an American company, and I live in London. So I have these three examples that I believe, if you take them individually, probably are among the three different ones, from a complete lockdown to somehow more relaxed policies. I won't name the countries, but I'm sure you can relate. So what we can offer is essentially a real-time view of that could drive and could help governments in taking decisions, for example, on what sectors to open first, what are the effect of this opening on the economy, and what are also the effects of not opening, or keeping some sectors closed. So let me give you some examples to make it real. First of all, starting from the macro scale, there's somebody calls it the end of globalization as we know it. Where international travel has stopped, and also the supply chains are becoming much more local. So by looking at this data on a global scale, international scale, we've built a product called Tourism Insights, and we're helping many governments, the French government, the Czech government, to see what the effect of people not traveling to the economies, because tourism is a big part of their GDP. The second one we see is acceleration of digitalization in every way. I'll give you some numbers. The digital economy in developing countries was around 10-11% of the total retail spend. We've seen in April and May that jumping to 22%. In the UK, it was actually 33%. We've seen a growth year on year in those months of 95% of digital. And that, we believe, is there to stay. For example, very concrete example, my mother is 81, never had a Netflix subscription. You know what? Now she's finally had Netflix. She loves it. She's not gonna drop it when things hopefully go back to normal. And you know what? She also has a delivery of food to her home. And again, I don't think she'll stop. She's really enjoying it. So that's key for the government, because if you think of small businesses, which are 50% of the economy and 90% of the workforce, they've been affected tremendously by the lockdown. And they live on a very, very thin working capital, and being closed for 3-4 weeks means that many of them need support. So I'll end with this, with a small business. We have a number of initiatives to support small businesses in partnership with many local governments along a couple of axes. One is helping them to get access to loans and support from the government. Again, loans can be given in different ways. The more you can get data out of the behavior of these loans, the more you can then fine tune and tweak those loans. So we're helping some governments in Europe to disburse loans via cards, and therefore getting data on how these loans are used. Secondly, as I said before, digitization is very important. So we're helping a lot of small businesses, again, through government programs, on helping them to get online, to accept payments online, and make sure they don't remain victims of the acceleration in digitalization. So I'll stop here. We've got a few more examples. I'm sure we can touch them later, Matt.
Thank you very much indeed. We are getting some questions coming in, but we'll have space for some more. So if anything you hear sparks a question, do type it in. And meanwhile, if we could hear from Enrique.
Sure, thanks a lot, Matt, and thank you very much for having me and the Development Bank of Latin America. And first, I would like to say that I completely agree with the previous panelists have already said, and I will try to build on some ideas while also taking from some of the comments. So I was thinking on today and remembering a piece by Richard Haas from the Council of Foreign Relations saying that this pandemic will not so much change the basic kind of direction of history as we know it, but to accelerate it, more or less what Fabricio was saying around digitalization. So building on this, I would like to focus on three main ideas that I see as accelerating in these times. And the first one is the issue at hand, which is data, and specifically data infrastructures. Said in another way, is data as an input, and data as the main and most important building block of all the digital technologies we have today. And that is very evident for some, maybe us working in the digital world for some time now, but it's not evident for everyone out there, especially for decision makers. So if you think of all the websites you visit, if you think in Netflix, if you think in the data packets that enable us to see each other through Zoom, artificial intelligence, data science, blockchain, so on and so forth, it is all about what data you have and how you work with it. So the good news today is that we have practically a universal generation of data everywhere at every single second, plus the computational capacity to use it. So that's the very good news, and it's why these issues have been widely said and addressed. The bad news is that this data tends to be disordered and in very low quality. So we have to work quite a lot to make it usable. And the way to make it usable is to generate it and manage it with the right technical and legal characteristics, which I'm sure that Jenny will talk more about in a second, plus the right governance frameworks that enable us to extract the value of data, regardless of the type it is, when we want it and when we need it. So a good example coming, for example, from the financial sector is the Open Banking Data Standard in the UK that relies on data being securely shared and openly published through APIs so that third parties being the fintechs, can use this data in a secure and private way. So if you bring or extrapolate this example to the COVID, what you see is that we need basically to understand what data is being released and how it should be released to enable its value while protecting privacy and security. So from the Development Bank in Latin America, along with many others, we're working in an international coalition, the OECD, the ODI, the Open Data Charter, GIFT, the Open Data for Development Networks, and the governments of Canada, Mexico, and New Zealand, to really identify how governments and communities are generating COVID-related data to meet their local needs. And the objective that we want is to have a guidance on how to responsibly release this data in the future. And this in three very concrete sectors. The first one is tracking the spread of the disease and tracking the health sector capacity at the same time. The second one, understanding government action in terms of the economic and social side of things. And third, the spread of and the behavior of the virus in our communities. So we are currently analyzing this data for approximately 50 governments all over the world and waiting to release this guide later this year. The second idea revolves around the use. How do you use this data once you have it? And there are, of course, various ways in which governments and private sector and everyone can use data, but I would like to focus on a very particular one, which is GovTech. And this is a global market of $400 billion a year. And when we talk about GovTech, we talk about a very specific thing, which is a new kind of public-private partnership in which governments work with data-driven startups to solve public problems. So GovTech is not government technology as a whole. GovTech is to government what fintech is to the financial sector, if you wish. So we from the bank decided to work and to focus on GovTech because of three very specific reasons. The first one is because it's a way of bringing expertise, agility, flexibility, and innovation to government. Said in another way is how to bring the startup mentality to governments, while at the same time promoting a high value added sector in the SMEs, which comprise more or less 98% of the economic units all over the world. So this is very important, particularly in a time that we live in, where we will need to revamp our economies, as Fabricio was rightly saying. The second reason is because GovTech does not aim to create a new thing inside government and a new responsibility for public servants that have already millions of things to do. But it's actually a strategy to align things that are already there: data, digital, innovation, entrepreneurship, so on and so forth, and to coordinate these efforts to potentialize the work that we are already doing. In other words, it's basically what Liz was saying. It's solving this coordination problem that you have in government with the idea of doing more with less. And the third reason is because it's a global strategy. And global, I'm not inventing this word, it's actually a term in international relations. And it means to tackle global problems, but by contextualizing it to the local needs and specificities of national governments, but more importantly, local governments at the state and in the municipal level. So for example, the startup OSCD in Panama is using blockchain to bring transparency not only to the outcomes of COVID-related social programs, but to the actual process of delivery, who does what when. CityBits in Spain is developing a tool to analyze the perceptions and concerns of citizens online to support evidence-based policy making for governments. And Predicto in Colombia is using AI to detect the changes in the blood flow of a patient's face to understand if a person might be sick or not, all the while protecting personal data and security of information. Amazing technology, the thing that they developed. And these are only three very concrete and very quick examples, but we see that this is happening all over the world. Governments working with startups to solve very concrete public problems. And from the bank, what we have just did is to launch the Gothic Index 2020. And this is really the first global measurement of the GovTech ecosystems to understand what is happening and to give some recommendations to governments wishing to kind of potentialize this new sector in the better way. In the coming months, we will be releasing the regional report, an observatory and an investment fund to further support these efforts in the mid and long run. And the third idea is quite straightforward, but it's often overlooked. And it is that data and digital technologies are just enablers of wider objectives. They're not ends by themselves. They're means toward wider policy objectives. And what really matters is to ask the right questions, to understand how and to what degree we should be using, if any, data and technology to address our policies. So for governments trying to respond to COVID, you really need to ask if data and technology is what you should be doing, because these massive projects entirely based on data and technology are almost always white elephants, which are very hard to develop, very hard to deliver, and even harder to maintain technically, financially, and politically. And this is a very important thing that often goes sideways all over the world. So just to close this idea, I think that what I'm trying to say is that we need to understand what challenges and opportunities data and technology can have in a very specific institutional and political regimes, and how to act upon them for the benefit of everyone. And the last caveat would be that today we're talking about COVID and everything is COVID related, but it's not the first issue that we have addressed at the global level, and it most definitely won't be the last. We have corruption, we have SDGs, we have inequality, development, unemployment. So that degree in which governments and international institutions prepare through data infrastructures, through their capacities for the use of exponential technologies, through methodologies or strategies such as GovTech, and that degree in which governments have a strategic view on how to use these technologies for their goals, will most likely, in this new world that we're entering in, differentiate successful governments which are able to meet the demands and expectations of the citizens from those who are not. And I think that's a very important thing to bear in mind in the coming months and years when we talk about data and the future of government. So that's it from my side, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And finally, Jenny.
Thanks very much, Matt. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jenny Tenston. I'm Vice President and Chief Strategy Advisor at the Open Data Institute, which is a UK-based not-for-profit that works with companies and governments to build an open and trustworthy data ecosystem. And the bit that I wanted to focus on was really about data flows and how data has or hasn't been passed around to the places where it needs to go. So if I look, I mean, I'm most familiar with the response that we've had in the UK. If I look at what's happened here, there's been a very understandable emergency kind of response by government, which is to try to gather all information it could possibly get hold of in order to just get a grip on the situation. And that's, from data from the calls that were coming in on the service to help people who might be reporting symptoms, things about new situation reports from hospitals in order to get understanding about ventilators and beds, information about PPE supply, information about testing, lots of data needing to be coming into the system centrally, and quite understandably in order to deliver and provide that kind of response. But what that's meant is that while all this information has been flowing in, there's been relatively little, at least until recently, information flowing back out. And that's meant that the response is quite understandable at a national level. If you want a national lockdown, then you need that national response. But when we need more local response, then that information hasn't quite been flowing to the places where it needs to go. Whether that's local government, whether that's local charities or citizen groups that are working locally in order to support people, whether that's to the private sector suppliers of services, of public services. And so this for me would be one area that we need to really look at and try to improve. It's quite understandable for central governments to be pulling data together for those national response questions, but it's not possible to run the entirety of an emergency response from a central location. How do we get that data spread more evenly? And then if I look forward even further, for me, we're entering a kind of phase where it's going to be much more down to individuals, their families, and individual businesses to work out what their level of risk appetite is around the different kinds of behaviours that they have. So, for example, do I know when to catch a train into work when it's not going to be too busy? Do I know when I should go and stand out in the cold for a shop when it comes to winter? These kinds of individual decisions or business decisions are going to be ever more vital. Understanding what the kind of consequences are going to be for individuals is going to be more vital as we go forward into the future. And there again, providing data as an infrastructure, as Enrique was saying, such that people can build applications and services that help us as citizens, that help us as small businesses to make decisions that are more tailored for us, for our risk appetites, for our particular situations, for me is going to be really crucial. So that gives us this, this real challenge, right? Because obviously government has a certain view on what's going on. It is able to bring together some sets of information. As Fabrizio has talked really eloquently about, other organisations, particularly private sector organisations, also have extremely useful views that can provide information both to governments, but also, I would argue, to individuals and to small businesses and to communities. How do we make sure that in a extremely changeable world that we're heading into, where we can't rely on the experiences that we've had in the past, how do we make sure that information is available for us for those decisions? And this information isn't information that we can just pass around willy-nilly. It matters who gets to see that information. In particular, much of it is going to be private or sensitive. Some information is going to be, it's just going to be kind of creepy, the way that people might use it, and we might get suspicion about misuse. In order to build the trust that Johannes was talking about, we need to be able to show that we're making good, sensible, thought through decisions about who gets access to what. And so the kinds of stewardship models that we need in order to provide good data governance that's quite responsive to needs is going to be ever more vital. And my final point would be that trust isn't just about transparency, and it isn't just about, although I completely agree with the points that were made earlier about involving participation from citizens in the process. It's also about how they see the benefit returning to them. So they can see it very obviously when they are provided with information that helps them make decisions. But we can also do better at describing how the availability of data has helped with the public service response to this crisis. And that, I think, will set us in a good foundation in the future for being able to use data in much more imaginative ways.
Thank you very much indeed, Jenny. So a lot of really interesting perspectives there, and we're running a bit short of time. So I was going to ask about examples of where you've seen effective projects in action in this field. I might actually ask you afterwards, and we'll put it in the write-up. So just thinking about how we can do this better at a national level, from what you've observed of how governments are using data in service delivery, could you name one of the challenges or weaknesses that exist in the way that governments operate, and suggest a way to help address it? And I think it probably makes sense to go in the same order. So perhaps, Johannes, I don't know if you've observed any common challenges and possible solutions.
Paris 21, so the organization I work for, we are mainly working with poor countries all over the world. And I think it's very interesting to see and hear from our conversation about the challenges that are actually, some of them I would say are relevant for all countries, and some are specifically for poor countries. Now, what I wanted to get at, and I also saw a question about the data ecosystem, about the participatory data ecosystem. It's I think all over this world, this new emergence of data providers over the last 10 years through digitalization, through the word of big data and the many things that Enrique was alluding to, which are based on technology, using this flow of information, has been shaping up and has been changing data ecosystem all over the world. So we see more and more data actors like private companies engaging. We see a civil society organization engaging. We see academia engaging. And I think Jenny used the word about stewardship and governance. And I think this is very key. Now, it's very different if we talk about stewardship and governance in Canada or in the UK in compared to Rwanda or to a Pacific island. One key point which seems to me important is that there need to be some trusted entity that can steer these different actors to enable and to produce the trust that is necessary for the citizens to see the benefit of all of it. And this agency and this entity, in our view, is national statistical offices. They are the legal mandated institution that can help, and a neutral sort of entity that could help to design all these things. Now, the problem, and you asked what needs to change, in particular in developing countries, in poor countries, is that they are heavily underfunded. If you look at the support of development cooperation, in total, the total support, there's only less than 1% given to data and statistics. So the generous support that the UK provides, Germany provides, and many other countries provide, only a small fraction is going to statistical offices, which I think needs to change. Sometimes we hear the argument, yeah, the private sector can do it. We can just trust the data and we can use the data for mobile phones, for instance. And everybody is saying, yeah, let's use a mobile phone, these CDRs, or let's take Google data, or let's take Twitter data. We don't need statistical offices, they're anyway outdated. But it's not true. I mean, we definitely see the need of all these big data can only function if it's ground truthed, if it's based on surveys, on censuses that have been produced according to UN standards and principles. So in that sense, my plea would be invest more also in national statistical systems data all over the world to make a good use, and in particular, coming back to the COVID, and I will close with this, now everybody is looking at, we discussed the impact of counting the affected people, and people start to realize that there are different ways of measuring those things and how to interpret this, and that's very good. Now we turn also increasingly to recovery policies. But I mean, the recovery policies, you need not only data on the health sector. Everybody is now so gung-ho about health-related data. But what you need is data on women and men's different effects of the crisis. You need data on employment, you need data on national accounts, you need data on everything. So let's not waste this opportunity to make good decisions based on evidence, but that comes from a trusted agency. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannes. Liz.
I'm going to be a bit of a broken record and say capability again. So I think it's quite interesting when you have, you know, centers of digital expertise, you're generally going to get maybe like a multiplier effect in that you start to think of like housing data in a database and having someone who can do Python and all of these like skills that go around managing data. Whereas for the most part, when departments, I think, we want to do data, or we want to like improve data, or we want to use data to drive efficiency, they don't spend the time or free up the people who know how to fix the problem, because they're in the middle of the problem at the moment, right? Like they are the data analysts who spend 90% of their time cleaning the data because it's in a spreadsheet, right? It's what we need is the investment of like, okay, we want to become a data-led organization. We want to unlock the power of data. It's going to be completely disruptive to your organization. And unless you expect that and prepare for it and invest in the time and the skills and the disruption, then you're going to get such little, you know, benefit from it. You might have slightly better spreadsheets and maybe a CRM, but you're not going to have things in a database. You're not going to be able to cross-reference data across different data sets. And I think that's the real problem we have, is that everyone thinks they can just do data with, you know, the people they have now, but the skills are different. Some of them will have the skills, but they then won't have the technology to utilize those skills. And so it's a match of both the technology, the people to use that technology, and then the time to do it, and not just the time to make the data better, but change the way the organization manages, collects, and analyzes that data.
Thank you, Liz. That's really interesting. Fabrizio.
So I've got two answers. One is what you would expect from somebody from the private sector, and that's cooperate more with the private sector. I'm sure everybody expected that one. I'll qualify, I'll give you some examples, but that's the obvious one. I'll come to that in a second. Let me also give you the less obvious one. And I think the less obvious one is, I think governments have really a role in helping collectively private companies and governments to establish trust. And I was really shocked hearing what happened in the UK when we talk about the tracing app and private companies, Google, Apple, going the let's say private way, the good data sharing way, and the government try to go the other way and pushing for more tracing, which, you know, I understand there is some sense, but almost like the other way around. So I think what I think Enrique mentioned, the open banking and the open data regulations that started in Europe, I think it was an excellent. I mean, as Master, we, you know, have ups and downs with the regulators, but I must admit that this one on open banking and on establish a common framework for sharing data among companies is an excellent one, because I often speak in public about the regulator as the innovator. As you can see, in London is the place where most of the fintechs have flourished, thanks also to the open banking regulation. So I think, you know, governments and regulators and the public sector in general is the one that could really drive with, you know, legislation a movement towards sharing, creating common framework in using data, helping with data governance. And, you know, there are many companies that are profiting from data, of course, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done in the right way. And the public and the people can trust that they own the data, they can do what they want with the data, they can stop sharing the data, and they can decide to share the data if they believe they are having something in return. I think today it's very opaque. It's not very transparent what people get for sharing their data. And I think a regulation in that respect is very, very important. There's a number of private companies. I mean, we're in a consortium together with Microsoft, together with a number of others who are proponent of strong anonymization, aggregation of data, and or, you know, strong consent if you want the data to be used in the right way. Let me come back to the first one. Let me give you an example. I know that people, you know, not like to hear examples. Let me give you a couple of examples of ways cooperating with government. I heard Jenny speaking about private companies giving tools also to the public at the global, but also local level. We've recently launched an initiative in the UK and in Italy, now expanding to 15 countries, called shopopenings.com. You might have heard of it. It's a very tiny thing, but I think it's very, very important. We recognize that people don't know if a shop is open or not. And during lockdown, the only way was to pick up the phone. Imagine you need a dentist and you need to call all the dentists around you to find out which one is open. Or imagine you want to go to your supermarket and you go there with your mask and you find that it's closed. And we realized that one of the ways to understand whether a shop was open or not was simply to see whether they accepted a MasterCard transaction in the last 3 days. Very easy, very obvious, but that's one of examples where private companies can help and support citizens. So we put up a website, it's free of charge. We cooperated with the governments. We talked to many governments. They're very happy to help us and put it up there. So it's there, it's working, it's easy. It's one of the example of things that we can do together. I mentioned earlier the disbursement cards. Let me also talk about that one. Again, we cooperated with a couple of governments. One of the problems of the recovery is that you give a lot of aid, and you know very well when aid is given, you're not really sure that it's being spent in the most efficient way. And usually, well, usually maybe it's a strong word, but often those who receive aid are the ones that they needed the least. So by having a traceable way through payment technology of understanding which sectors are receiving the aid, which sector needed the most, it's one of the ways that governments and public sector and private sector can cooperate. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Enrique.
So let me exemplify this with a very, very short story. A couple of years ago, a university in Mexico developed an algorithm to detect cancer through analyzing X-rays. So for those of you who more or less know how this works, you have a data set training, you divide it in two, you train your algorithm, and then you prove it with the rest of the data, basically, in a very general sense. So the pilot worked, and it worked quite well. When they wanted or tested this on the ground in the real world, it was a complete failure. When they analyzed the reasons why it was a failure, they realized that they've trained the algorithm with training data sets which were X-rays from people in the United States, because data from the US was readily available. And of course, the physical and genetic characteristics of people in the US, populations in the US and in Mexico, are quite different. The lesson here is that if you don't have the right infrastructure in your countries to do the algorithms, to do the AI, to do the data intelligence, data science, and everything that we've talked about, you will fail. So if you don't have the basic ingredients, you can have the recipe. And we need to build that data and digital foundations that Liz was talking about before doing everything else. People sometimes forget this because it's very tempting to do the attractive stuff, the big visualizations, the big announcements. But the real technical thing and the real input is what matters. And in many, I would say most countries in the world, this is in a very, very low stages of maturity, and we have to work through private sector, through governments, international organizations to build this infrastructure for the future of whatever data issue we might have at hand.
Thank you. And Jenny.
And I think the question was about what the barriers are, the biggest barrier for government improving around this. And actually, my reflection is that one of the biggest barriers has been around trust in citizens. So what I've seen is government not making available as much data or to as much detail as perhaps they should, but more importantly, not providing the background, in some cases, not providing background information about what they're doing with data, how they're using it, why they're pulling it together in the way that they are, and so on, or at least not doing it until it's kind of wrestled out of them, not doing it in a proactive way, and you can kind of understand that because it's a very it's an emergency situation. It's probably last thing in your mind is to communicate about what it is you're doing. You're probably also worried it's a political situation. You're worried about the way in which you might be being shown up in the statistics and the things that might be going wrong. But the trouble is that when that data, when information about what you're doing with data or data itself is hidden, then citizens actually assume that you're hiding something because there's something there to hide, something that you should be concerned or worried about. And so it just spirals into kind of speculation and so on. So not only have you now got the needing to put out the information that you already needed to put out, but you've also got the dealing with all of the fires that have started because of it. So I think that there's this kind of, the biggest barrier is this kind of trust in citizens, not to overreact, not to, even when they're presented with multiple figures that mean that have been counted in slightly different ways, to be able to understand that and to have a bit of a conversation about it. And for me, then, I will actually echo what Johannes was saying about the importance of independent national statistics agencies in providing that, because the fact of their independence means that the figures that they can supply are more trustworthy by citizens, but it also means that they're not quite so, or shouldn't be quite so constrained by the political kind of pressures that there might be on other government organisations. So really, I would echo what Johannes was saying about strengthening NSOs and their ability to provide information quickly and in an independent way, and proactively, even more proactively than we see in usual activity, because when we don't have information, we make stuff up and we panic. Yeah, so just a plea for more transparency.
Thank you, Jenny. Right, we have 14 minutes left. I would want to get through a couple more questions. So there's one in particular which I think is quite important. We've had a number of questions come in about it. It is about trust. Not, as Jenny just discussed, governments trusting citizens, but actually citizens trusting governments. People will be reluctant to share their data unless they're confident in what government is going to do with it. So if I could ask for short answers, but I mean, for contact tracing apps, for example, are only going to work if they're downloaded by a large majority of the population. So how can governments build and maintain the trust required for citizens to share data with them? And what kind of incidents or behaviour most put that trust at risk? But yes, if we could have short answers. And once again, I'll come to you, Johannes.
Well, thank you. And I'm obviously glad that this topic of trust is coming to the fore, which I think I mean, we talk a lot about technology, and sometimes we don't tend to see what the real issues are and as important technology is. But let me give one additional element, which I think builds on what Jenny and colleagues were just saying before, which I think is linked to trust, but seems to me as important. And it's something that I think Liz was mentioning a couple of times, which you called capacity and capacity. I think if we look at the debates, even in our own households, I would say, if you sit in front of with your kids and see these numbers and figures, and what I can realize is that we lack, all, me included, is a certain data literacy. I mean, it's in terms of basic literacy about data and how to see different related data and studies to make sense out of it. So the trust question is also, to some extent, linked to a big push on both sides, I would say, on the side of the users to be comfortable to relate all to those data. And a little of, we should maybe think about how do you say this, a driving license for data use or something, like we even building up more incentivizing citizens to be familiar and to use some of those things. So that's one. And second, I think we also, and I agree very much, and we are as a statistical community fully aware that we have been too long in our Eiffel Towers, and that we need to get more out, and we need to be more on the data dissemination and get to talk to colleagues and make sense of what we produce. And this is also for the private sector and for everybody else. So it has to be coming both from the producer and from the user side to help all of us to make more sense and to be comfortable to, I think trust will only be built if we better understand what's going on. And as we realize, I mean, it's so many things happening. We have to be modest, but I think we have to make an additional effort. And maybe that's something for governments to look for little things to improve our knowledge on basic things. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. How do governments build public trust and how do they wreck it?
I always find this question or sharing data with government a bit of a catch-22, because we're in service delivery, you're basically stuck between the ideal of people want things to be very easy to use and personalized, but the only way you get that is with collecting data. And so you're always kind of stuck with like, what's appropriate? I'm not sure I have the answer, anyone has the answer today, but I think making things as clear as possible for users when they're accessing services and giving data what exactly your data is going to be used for, and not like reams of pages. Like I remember in the early days of gov.uk and GDS, we had long discussions with government lawyers and policy people about terms of agreement, for example, for using a service. And the simpler and clearer you can make that for users, I think helps with trust, to know that this isn't going to be used or this is going to be used. and then have a really easy opt-out mechanism. So for the NHS records, for example, there is an opt-out for using your health records for research, for example. But you have to go through kind of several links, and like it's fairly easy to do, but it probably could be easier. And so tying all those things together at the point you're giving data, what's it being used for, and can I opt out of it at any given point might help with that. But I agree with Johannes, like the data literacy stuff is really fascinating. And we get equally people who are very wary of kind of governments and data, and then people who will tell us their entire life stories in help desk tickets, for example, and giving us all of their personal data, which we have to redact. So there is no one type of person who thinks about trust and data, and some people don't think at all, but it's our job to help, frame that and help people who don't want to think about it or don't understand to understand the easiest ways possible, so we don't lose that trust later when something, happens.
Thank you, Liz. Fabrizio?
Yeah, so it's something that in the private sector everybody is awakening very fast, because it's something that it's threatening a lot of business cases around the world. There are many companies, many large companies who actually make their living by using data and selling data. I mean, luckily we're not one of those. We have another underlying business model, but we still have, to use some of the data. So I think, we're battling with this, and I think that it comes down to two things, to be honest, if we want to simplify. And people respond to incentives, and there are two things that I believe people are thinking right now. One is, how do I make sure that I in control? People like to be in control, and right now the data discussion honestly has been a little bit out of control. So giving the control back to the user, I think is important. The second thing might be a bit cynical, but that's, I believe, how people will respond, is what do I get in return? And if you combine those two things, how can I control what I give? And when I give something, am I sure that I'm getting something in return which is valuable, which is not necessarily a product? It could be, my health, or it could be my contribution to the society. I think people will start to understand why it's important to share data. And I think you mentioned it, an opt-out mechanism, or the opportunity and the possibility to, if you want, not be able to share data is important, so people don't feel forced. So the combination of having my choice, understanding how I can control it, and understanding what I can get are the three principles that are behind data sharing. I think a lot of legislation and regulation are going that way. I think we should all try to make it clear to the public.
Thank you. Enrique?
So trust, I think that when we talk about data, as in many other policy sectors, we tend to talk it in the abstract. So we need to bring that abstract into reality. And the way to make people trust governments is to make people understand and feel how what government does actually changes their reality, so that they can be better off. So in a sentence, it would be deliver and communicate in that order. That's the way you build trust.
Thank you very much. And Jenny?
It was admirably short. So I would point to two things. So first of all, we often have ethics groups and committees and other kinds of boards, perhaps with external people. I would say listen to what they say. It isn't just about telling people what you are doing with data as government. It's also about listening to what people say about how they what they find acceptable and what they don't find acceptable. And this goes beyond individual personal controls over data. This is about the basic processing that is permitted, for example, under GDPR for public interest reasons. Listen to what the public say about what is in their interest. The second thing that I would say around trust is that realize that you can't win them all. So mistrust is infectious. The way that people will feel about the government's use of data will be a big reflection of the way in which they feel about government overall and its response to COVID-19 overall. And therefore, there's only so much that you can do if you are doing a data project in order to win that trust back. So you can try and do as much as you can, but don't beat yourself up if basically government isn't trusted anyway, and that's outside of your control.
Thank you, Jenny. We have only 4 minutes, so I'm going to ask one last question. But before we get to that one, just briefly, we have answered some of the questions, at least indirectly, but from Andrew Wren, so it points out lots of fundamental information about COVID remains uncertain. Things like acquired immunity, how long does it last, how robust is it, what's your risk of infection in different settings. These are things which, fundamental points we still don't know. I don't know if anybody has a perspective on whether big data can help us resolve those questions and whether there's a route to doing so. If anybody wishes to speak on that one. No, I won't.
I'll take a stab.
Go, Liz. Yeah.
I don't know if big data can necessarily understand complexity where there's no data. We can't have big data answers, and I think a lot of these questions are still in the stage where we just don't know. And even if we know, there's going to be multiple answers, and so they might be able to narrow down the answers for us. But ultimately, a lot of these things are probably going to come down to a decision by a human rather than numbers. It would be great if it could, though. I'm all for that, but I'm not certain it's going to have the answer anytime soon.
That's fair enough. Thank you. I thought it was an interesting question. I thought it was good. Get an answer. So we only have 3 minutes really. So I'd ask for very brief, snappy answers to this last one. But I just wonder if you could each name one kind of key change that you'd like to see that would improve government's ability to use data in COVID-related service delivery. It could be in culture, legislation, capabilities, politics. One change that would make a difference. Johannes?
Yeah, I would say that the main change that I think we should see is capacity development in this broad sense. So away from just only looking at production side of things, but also understanding the users, the trust part, and to have the communication in place. So capacity development from both the government agencies, but also supporting the users through the data literacy, through some of those things would be for me key. Thank you.
Thank you. Liz, you mentioned that. I hope you didn't steal yours.
Again, I'm a broken record. Yeah, I would like to see people who manage data be as supported as a service team developing a service, because that's essentially what they're going to run, especially if they're going to open, make data open through APIs and things like that. That needs to be supported long term and unlock kind of wider digital economy benefits. So yeah, treat data teams like service teams with all their support needed.
Thank you. Fabrizio? Is Fabrizio there? Getting no sound. He may have looking a bit frozen. We'll move on to Enrique.
Sure. So building on capacity and in teams, I would like to see more data literacy in high-level decision makers. They need to understand why they should be doing this and how, beyond just making statements and commitments.
Another wonderful, pithy answer. Thank you. And Jenny.
And I will say, just get really much better at sharing data. So if we're going to concentrate on capacity, then not just about how to use it, not just about how to build it, but also about how to share it.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much indeed. We are out of time. So thank you to all of our panel very much indeed. I really value your time. And thank you to Mastercard Data Services for making it possible, to everybody for watching. In a couple of weeks, we will produce an article or feature covering this session, and we'll distribute it along with the recording of the whole webinar. And meanwhile, we will write to those who've sent in questions and haven't been answered, to write to you individually as well. Please do come back in 30 minutes time for the second panel discussion covering the use of big data. Thank you very much to everybody and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm back. Too late. Bye.
Bye bye.